Hi, my name is Savannah Cohenour, and today I will be talking to you about COPD. So, what is COPD? COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It is a respiratory disease that affects your lower respiratory tracts. It's a combination of three subdiseases known as emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and chronic asthma. So, a little bit about the history before we get into the depth of the disease. It was first recognized in 1679 by a doctor in Switzerland. He noticed that people were starting to be diagnosed with lung issues, different things going on there. So after that, different countries started to notice the same thing, and they started to dig into the problems that people were starting to experience that were killing people really early on in their life. So they learned about COPD through human autopsy. They took cadavers of patients that were healthy or that were suspected to have lung conditions. They would actually cut open the lungs, and then they would bring in groups of medical students, and they would teach and learn this way. So in 1965, a man named Dr. William Briscoe was the first to refer to COPD as COPD. He found the direct causes of what COPD is, and then he named it accordingly chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, describing what the disease actually does. So, after that, in about 1965 to 1980s, they had conferences in Denver, Colorado. This was a combination of doctors all around the United States and some other countries that came in, and they discussed what was going on about COPD, how to treat it, what they've discovered, further advancements, and how to attack it as a country as a whole. So, during this, they actually found that lungs were voluminous, and they hold the air that we breathe in, and they participate in something called gas exchange, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But, in one of the later conferences, a man named Charles Fletcher actually found that there was a direct correlation between smoking and development of COPD. So what causes it? Like I just said, the direct correlation between smoking and COPD is extremely high. So the number one cause of COPD is actually smoking. Other ways that people develop COPD is exposure to air pollutants, a chronic exposure of secondhand smoke or other pollutants, and then some genetic factors come into play that can't be controlled. But here is a picture of smoker's lungs versus a normal patient who has never smoked in their life, and it just shows the damage that it does to your lungs over time. So who does it affect? Like I said a minute ago, smoking. Smokers, long-time smokers, and smokers of just a few years are all at risk for COPD development. Women are actually more likely than men to develop COPD, and this is in the age ranges of 65 to 74. People that are jobless, single, have a history of asthma, and who participate in high-risk jobs such as firefighters who are exposed to air pollutants all the time are all at a higher risk as well. So some of the symptoms you would see with a COPD patient would be shortness of breath, frequent coughing, wheezing, excess mucus production, difficulty breathing, and low O2 stats overall. So how do they diagnose COPD? They diagnose it using something called spirometry. So they take a spirometer, which a patient blows into, and it measures the amount of voluminous air that's being expelled by the patient. So for COPD patients, they expel less air than a normal healthy patient. And as these graphs are showing, you have a normal patient right here and the rate and volume that they blow off in a certain amount of time. You have an asthma patient compared to the normal. You have a COPD patient and an asthma COPD patient overlap. And you can see that the COPD and the asthma COPD actually correlate and show just about the same, with the COPD and asthma together overlap being the worst. Asthma is, you can clearly see, actually a better turnout than a COPD patient. So emphysema, the first disease we're going to talk about as the subdisease of COPD, is the destruction of the alveoli, which are sacs in your lungs that actually make up the most surface volume, and they take in the air that you're breathing in to do gas exchange later on with your bloodstream and push oxygen out to your blood vessels to distribute to your organs and the rest of your body, while CO2 comes across into the alveoli during expellation. That CO2 gets pushed out. So what happens is that those alveoli get destroyed. That means there's a loss of surface area. So the inside of these sacs, there's different pockets. They lose the middle pockets and it becomes one big sac. So this loses the elasticity in the lung, so it can't contract and push to bring in the air and expel the air like it should. And like I said, a widening and loss of the alveolar function. And this is just an example of what I'm talking about. You have healthy lungs right here and emphysema lungs right there. So here's a healthy alveoli. Over time, say you're smoking, the destruction becomes prevalent inside of the alveoli, breaking up all these different sections and eventually making it a large space that no longer functions correctly. So chronic bronchitis, the second disease I want to talk about, is inflammation of the bronchioles. So this is just inflamed bronchioles with swelling. It's a slow progression. They can become more inflamed over time and actually get better, but the person will always have chronic bronchitis. It never actually goes away completely. So what happens when your bronchioles inflame is there's a phlegm and mucus production that your lungs normally have just to lubricate everything, but where they become inflamed, that mucus and stuff builds up in your lungs and you can't get rid of that. So it creates like a sticky feeling. That's when you hear wheezing and stuff in your COPD patients, and it prohibits full exhalation. So they can take a breath in, but they can't get that CO2 to blow off like it should. And this is just an example. These are your bronchioles. You see a normal bronchiole with it's widened, but here's an inflamed lining of the bronchiole, becomes much smaller, and that mucus begins to plug up the bronchial tubes. Chronic asthma is the third and last disease I want to talk about in COPD. It is just periodic inflammation of airways. It's very, very similar to asthma. It's just developed over a course of time from particles and pollutants that trigger the asthma attacks. So it's a narrowing of your airways, your bronchioles, your bronchioles. It causes difficulty expelling CO2 and actually breathing it as well. It swells, but it doesn't secrete mucus, which separates it from chronic bronchitis. And it rests over time, so it's only brought up with asthma attacks, so something provokes it. And this is just a picture of lungs without asthma compared to lungs with asthma. And once again, you see that swelling that happens. So treatments for COPD. Most COPD patients get put on high flow oxygen on a daily 24/7. They have to have the oxygen flowing in or they aren't receiving the full amount that they need. Breathing treatments, which is just inhaled steroids such as I think it's Atrovent, and your inhalers and different things like that. And then the removal of a source can actually be a treatment method. So stopping smoking will make the world of difference in a COPD patient and actually give them a longer lifespan. But once again, COPD does not have a cure, so these are all just treatments to try to better the condition as much as possible and help the patient with daily living. These are my sources, and I thank you for listening today.